On the morning of August 26, 1980, inside Harveys Casino in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, a routine shift quietly crossed an invisible line. A night supervisor walking through a restricted staff area noticed a large metal object resting where nothing had been scheduled, logged, or delivered. It had no power cable, no markings, no obvious purpose, yet it was positioned with unsettling care, elevated on wooden blocks, as if someone wanted it to be seen but never touched. Next to it lay a single letter, written with chilling precision, warning that any movement could trigger a catastrophic reaction. In that instant, the building stopped being a casino and became a question mark. Within minutes, what seemed like a suspicious package evolved into something far more disturbing. Specialists would later describe the device as one of the most complex constructions law enforcement had ever encountered. Not because of its size alone, but because of the intent behind it. This was not an impulsive act. It was deliberate, calculated, and designed to remove every safe option. The message was unmistakable. There would be no easy solution, no clean victory, no reset button. As authorities evacuated hundreds of guests and employees, another truth slowly emerged. This was not an attack driven by ideology or spectacle. It was personal. Somewhere beyond the flashing lights and empty gaming tables was a man who believed he had been humiliated, erased, and discarded. And in his mind, the casino was no longer a building. It was the embodiment of betrayal. This story is not about a machine, and it is not about money alone. It is about how resentment hardens, how obsession replaces reason, and how a single individual, armed with patience and skill, can force an entire system into a corner. To understand how this moment came to exist, we must step away from the casino floor and trace the long, uneasy path that led one man to believe that destruction was the only form of justice left to him. Long before Harveys Casino became the focal point of fear and evacuation, this story began with one man shaped by survival rather than stability. He was born in 1922 in a part of Eastern Europe where childhood meant discipline, scarcity, and learning. Early, that weakness was punished. Violence was not an exception in his upbringing. It was routine. Authority was not something to trust, only something to endure or outlast. These early years did not create a villain, but they forged something just as dangerous later on, a man who believed control was the only form of safety. As World War II consumed the continent, survival instincts turned into hard rules for living. Military service offered structure, but it also deepened his reliance on obedience, hierarchy, and technical precision. When borders shifted and alliances collapsed, he found himself on the losing side of history, facing imprisonment, interrogation, and years of forced labor. For him, this was not just punishment. It was proof that systems always crush the individual, and that the only way to escape that fate was to become indispensable. When he eventually arrived in the United States as a political refugee, carrying little more than determination and a fierce belief in self-reliance, he embraced the promise he thought America offered. He worked relentlessly, mastering metal fabrication, welding, and mechanical problem-solving, skills that rewarded patience and punished mistakes. These were trades where precision mattered, where control could be absolute if you knew what you were doing. Slowly, painfully, he built a life. A family followed, then a business, then more businesses. Money came, but more important to him was what it represented, proof that he had beaten the system. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, he had achieved what many would call success. Properties, luxury cars, private aircraft access, and social status were no longer distant dreams. Yet beneath that outward prosperity, something was already eroding. His worldview left no room for vulnerability. Disagreement felt like disrespect. Independence felt like betrayal. Inside his home, authority was enforced, not negotiated. And when cracks appeared in his personal life, he did not see them as warnings. He saw them as challenges to his dominance. This was the contradiction that defined him. He believed completely in the American dream, but only on his terms. Hard work justified everything. Power excused cruelty. And success, once achieved, had to be permanent. Failure was not an option, because failure meant returning to a world where he had once been helpless. As long as money flowed and recognition followed, these beliefs remained hidden behind productivity and ambition. But the foundation was fragile, and when the first signs of loss appeared, they did not threaten his finances alone. They threatened the identity he had spent decades constructing, an identity that could not survive humiliation. That fear of falling back into insignificance would soon push him toward a place where effort no longer created control, and where chance ruled instead. That place was not a battlefield or a factory floor. It was the casino. What drew him toward the casino was not the lights or the noise, but the promise of restored control. Inside, places like Harveys Casino, money spoke louder than history, reputation, or character. A man could walk in carrying cash and instantly command attention, respect, and privileges that had nothing to do with who he was yesterday. For someone whose identity depended on dominance and recognition, this environment felt intoxicating. Every wager became a statement. Every win reinforced the belief that skill and nerve could still bend reality in his favor. At first, the results seemed to justify that belief. Large bets earned him special treatment, private rooms, complimentary services, and a level of deference that mirrored the power he felt slipping away elsewhere in his life. Dealers knew his name, staff anticipated his needs. The casino did not care about his past, only about his willingness to play big and lose often. And in that transaction, he felt seen again. Gambling was no longer recreation, it was validation. But casinos are built on a quiet truth that high-value players rarely want to accept. The system does not reward loyalty, it rewards volume. As long as money circulates, doors remain open. The moment it slows, the tone changes. Losses accumulated faster than victories, and what began as controlled risk gradually shifted into compulsion. The rules he once trusted no longer applied. Discipline eroded, replaced by the belief that one decisive win could undo everything that had gone wrong. Debt followed, not as a sudden collapse but as a steady tightening. Credit lines shrank. Checks were questioned. Conversations that once felt respectful became transactional. The same casino that had treated him like royalty now treated him like a liability. This shift cut deeper than the financial damage. To him, it was not business. It was rejection. The breaking point was not bankruptcy, illness, or even family estrangement. It was humiliation. A moment when a privilege he considered permanent was withdrawn without ceremony, simply because someone else was worth more. In that instant, the illusion shattered. He was no longer indispensable. He was replaceable. For a man who had survived war, imprisonment, and exile, this realization was unbearable. He did not see his losses as the result of chance or addiction. He saw them as evidence that the system he had trusted had turned against him. The casino stopped being a place of possibility and became a symbol of everything that had taken from him without consequence. From that moment on, gambling was no longer about winning money. It was about reclaiming dignity. And when dignity seemed impossible to recover through the rules of the game, another idea began to form, one that would turn patience, technical skill, and resentment into something far more dangerous. By the time his financial reality could no longer be denied, the damage extended far beyond money. His health was failing. His relationships were fractured, and the authority he once enforced so effortlessly had evaporated into fear and distance. What remained was a man cornered by loss on every front, unable to accept that chance, not conspiracy, had undone him. Instead of reflection, he chose reinterpretation. In his mind, he was not addicted, he was wronged. The casino became the center of that narrative. Every rejected check, every tightened credit limit, every polite but distant interaction reinforced the belief that he had been deliberately stripped of respect. He convinced himself that the rules had changed without warning, that loyalty had been punished, and that those who once benefited from his spending had abandoned him the moment he became inconvenient. This was not a rational assessment. It was a psychological defense, transforming personal failure into external betrayal. Isolation accelerated the process. Family members kept their distance, not out of indifference, but out of fear and exhaustion. Conversations turned into confrontations. Concern was interpreted as disrespect. Any attempt to intervene felt like an attack on his autonomy. As his world narrowed, his thinking hardened. There was no longer room for nuance or shared responsibility. There was only cause and enemy. Illness stripped away the illusion of time. Doctors' words landed not as warnings, but as deadlines. The future he had imagined was gone, and the present offered no path back to relevance. For someone who had defined himself through productivity and dominance, this was the ultimate humiliation. He was no longer feared, admired, or needed. He was invisible. It was during this period that his thinking crossed a critical threshold. He stopped asking how to recover and began asking how to be remembered. Not as a failure, not as a gambler who lost everything, but as someone who forced acknowledgement. Someone who could still command attention from a system that had dismissed him. Revenge, in this context, was not impulsive rage. It was a calculated response to perceived erasure. The casino represented more than a business. It symbolized a world that extracted value from him and then moved on without consequence. In his logic, that imbalance demanded correction. Once that belief took hold, the path forward became disturbingly clear. He no longer needed money to survive. He needed leverage. And leverage, he understood better than most, came from control, precision, and the ability to leave no safe alternatives. The idea forming in his mind was not yet a plan, but it had one defining characteristic. It would force the casino, and everyone who relied on it, to finally listen. What followed was not a burst of anger, but a period of silence and preparation. He withdrew from public view, spending long stretches of time alone, working methodically, driven by a belief that patience could restore the control he had lost everywhere else. This was not unfamiliar territory for him. Years of manual labor and mechanical work had taught him that complex problems yielded only to focus, repetition, and precision. Where others might have lashed out, he chose to build. In his mind, this was no longer about money. The figure he would eventually demand was symbolic, a number meant to reflect decades of perceived exploitation and disrespect. What mattered was leverage, and leverage required something the casino could not ignore, delay, or quietly absorb as a financial loss. He understood institutions well enough to know that fines, lawsuits, and threats meant little to organizations built to withstand them. What they feared was uncertainty, a situation where no rulebook applied and no expert could promise a clean solution. Every decision during this phase reflected that philosophy. He was not interested in spectacle or chaos. He wanted inevitability. Whatever he created had to eliminate negotiation by force of design alone. The concept rested on a simple idea. If every possible response led to the same unacceptable outcome, then control shifted entirely to the person who set the conditions. It was a way of turning technical knowledge into authority, of replacing social status with mechanical certainty. This process also revealed the most dangerous aspect of his mindset. He did not see himself as reckless. On the contrary, he believed he was being logical, even restrained. In his reasoning, the responsibility for what would happen next did not rest with him, but with those who refused to acknowledge his grievance. If harm occurred, it would be because they had no choice, not because he lacked empathy. This moral inversion allowed him to move forward without hesitation. As the work progressed, the line between preparation and commitment disappeared. There was no longer an option to abandon the idea without admitting weakness, something he was psychologically incapable of doing. The project became proof of competence, of relevance, of superiority over a system that had dismissed him. By the time he was finished, the object he had created was no longer just a tool. It was a message, carefully engineered to ensure that every second it existed forced a decision. And once that message was delivered, the situation would no longer belong to him alone. It would belong to everyone who had to respond to it, under pressure, in full view of the world. Once the device was discovered inside Harveys Casino, the balance of power shifted instantly. What had been conceived in isolation now belonged to law enforcement, emergency responders, and federal authorities, all operating under the same constraint. No one truly understood what they were facing. Evacuation orders emptied the building and surrounding area, but safety was only partial. The real danger lay not in movement, but in time. Every passing minute carried the same unanswered question. Could this situation be resolved without irreversible consequences? Specialists approached the problem with caution, shaped by experience, yet this case defied routine protocols. There was no clear access point, no reliable method to assess internal mechanisms without risk. Conventional procedures depended on predictability, and predictability was precisely what had been engineered out of the situation. Each option available to authorities carried the same unacceptable possibility. Attempting intervention could accelerate disaster. Waiting could do the same. Negotiation became the only path that preserved time. Communications were treated as fragile lifelines, not because of trust, but because delay itself was a resource. The demand was explicit, the conditions rigid, and the margin for error non-existent. This was not a standoff between equals. It was a test of endurance between a system designed to minimize harm and an individual who believed harm was already inevitable. Inside command centers, pressure mounted. Experts from multiple agencies weighed imperfect data, conflicting theories, and public scrutiny that grew louder by the hour. Outside, media attention transformed uncertainty into spectacle. What had begun as a controlled evacuation evolved into a regional crisis, with each decision scrutinized in real time. Yet, behind closed doors, the reality was simpler and far more unsettling. No one could guarantee a safe outcome. Eventually, the question stopped being whether to act and became how to accept responsibility for acting. Choosing intervention meant acknowledging that restraint was no longer neutral. It meant accepting that inaction was also a decision, one that carried consequences just as severe. When the final course was set, it was not driven by confidence but by necessity. The outcome confirmed what many had feared. The device behaved exactly as its creator had intended. Damage was severe, the message unmistakable. Yet, in the absence of casualties, the immediate crisis ended not with victory, but with relief. For authorities, the situation was contained. For the casino, the cost was measurable and repairable. For the man who set everything in motion, however, the result was something else entirely. His objective was never escape or profit. It was acknowledgement, and in that sense, the plan succeeded. The system he believed had erased him was forced to respond on his terms, if only once. What followed would unfold slowly through investigation, testimony, and judgment. But the moment that defined the entire story had already passed. It was the moment when resentment, skill, and isolation converged, proving that a single individual, driven by perceived injustice, could hold an entire institution hostage to uncertainty. In the months that followed, the crisis faded from headlines, but it did not disappear. Investigators worked backward through phone records, witness statements, and personal histories, slowly assembling the portrait of a man whose life had narrowed until only one option felt meaningful to him. The legal process was methodical, almost clinical, stripping away mythology and leaving behind cause and consequence. Courtrooms replaced command centers. Evidence replaced speculation. And what had once terrified an entire region was reduced to exhibits and transcripts. The final verdict brought closure in the formal sense, yet it offered little resolution on a human level. The casino repaired its losses, reopened, and continued operating under a different name, as institutions often do. Security protocols were rewritten. Training manuals were updated. The device itself, once a threat, became a teaching instrument, studied not for what it destroyed, but for what it revealed about vulnerability and design. Systems learned. Buildings recovered. The man at the center of it all did not. Removed from public attention, he spent his final years in confinement, his health failing, his world reduced to routine and memory. There was no redemption arc, no dramatic reversal, only time, and the quiet reality that the attention he had forced came at the cost of everything else. His name survived not as a warning he intended, but as a case study, a footnote in the long record of how personal grievance can escalate when left unchecked. This story resists simple conclusions. It is not a tale of good versus evil, nor a celebration of authority or defiance. It is a reminder that systems built on profit, efficiency, and replacement often overlook the psychological weight they place on individuals who tie their identity entirely to success. When recognition disappears, some adapt, others fracture. The question left behind is not whether the outcome could have been avoided, but where responsibility truly begins. Does it start with institutions that reward excess and discard failure, or with the individual who chooses destruction over accountability? The answer is uncomfortable, because it lies somewhere in between. And that is precisely why stories like this continue to matter, long after the noise has faded and the lights have come back on.